Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Charities in a No-Deal Brexit, hosted jointly by NCVO and the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. My name is Ben Westerman and I'm going to be presenting the webinar today. I am the EU Policy Manager at NCVO. Joining me are three officials from Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And we've got Tom Leftwich, who's the Head of Engagement and Strategy in the Office of Civil Society. He'll tell you a little bit more about their work in just a moment. Sarah Johnson, who is a Data Policy Advisor there, and Andrew Hodgetts, who is a Senior Policy Advisor on International and Youth Strategy. Today, NCVO has published comprehensive guidance for charities on implications of a no-deal Brexit for charities and civil society organisations and practical actions and operational decisions trustees and boards can take to deal with some of the consequences that a no-deal scenario throws up. It's really important that the charities are engaging with that, and we hope that you'll find that useful. We've talked previously at NCVO about areas where charities might be affected by a no-deal exit, and what we've tried to stress is that being prepared is the most important thing. Whatever the outcome of what happens over the next few weeks and months, being prepared is really important, and the most vital thing is that charities are thinking now about what steps they can take to deal with some of the changes that might come from any Brexit scenario, and putting in place plans that are resilient and are flexible will be beneficial to organisations regardless of what happens in Westminster over the coming weeks. So we hope that this will be a practical and useful kind of run through of the policy areas that will be affected in a no-deal scenario specifically, but also actions that are useful in any scenario. As you can see on your screens, we're going to work through a few areas: workforce data, funding, and then a short section on state aid and volunteering. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's been going on in Westminster and what that means for Brexit, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Please do type in with your questions throughout, and we'll address them as many as we can and as best we can at the end. So before I hand over to Tom to talk through the first area we'll be looking at today, we're going to have a quick poll to gauge where you think your organisation is at on a no-deal Brexit. That should be on your screens now. It'll be interesting for us to see how prepared you think you are, and particularly on the last point, not able to prepare. If you do feel that you haven't been able to put any plans in place, it'd be interesting perhaps in the questions or perhaps afterwards if you want to write to NCVO directly to talk about why you feel that's the case and where we can help you there. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see the results of that. So yeah, that's roughly what we expected. 42% of you have said that some preparation work undertaken, and that's good to hear. Obviously, the point of today is to push that further and to think through all the areas where you may be affected. So we will push on in that light to the first topic, which is immigration, and for that I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just before I start talking about immigration, I'll just say a little bit from government's perspective. So as Ben said, my name is Tom Leftwich. I'm from the Office for Civil Society, where I lead on a range of different priorities, including our work to prepare civil society for Brexit. For those who don't know, the Office for Civil Society is government's central unit that works with and to support civil society organisations of all kinds. And we are based in the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. That's why that's the branding on the presentation today. It won't surprise you to hear that leaving the European Union is the top priority for government at the moment. And while we continue to work for a deal, despite recent events, a no-deal scenario remains very much a possibility at this time, which is why this webinar is so important today. Government has generally been stepping up all of our preparations to help ensure the country is as ready as it can be for a no-deal event. And we are particularly keen from the Office for Civil Society to ensure that charities and social enterprises are fully prepared as well. This webinar forms part of these events, and we are very grateful to NCVO for working with us today to help set this up. More broadly, government has launched a public information campaign, which you may already be familiar with. This has a range of official guidance and outlines key steps that can be taken by individuals and organisations to prepare, and that can be found at gov.uk/Brexit. We've also published a brief 5-point guide for civil society organisations specifically, which can also be found on gov.uk, and links to both of those will be in the presentation, which you can access after the webinar. Throughout, we're hoping to signpost you to relevant guidance so that you are aware of all the necessary steps to take and ensure that you are prepared. I'll now come on to immigration, and particularly immigration for EU nationals. So after we leave the European Union, freedom of movement is going to come to an end, but that certainly doesn't mean that EU citizens who are currently living and working in the UK will have to leave. In his very first speech, the Prime Minister went out of his way to recognise the contribution of EU nationals to the UK. And in OCS, we know that many of those are working in charities and social enterprises across a range of sectors. The PM also repeated government's unequivocal guarantee to those currently living and working here that they will be able to continue to do so after exit. To make this possible, the government has set up a scheme for EU nationals to apply for settled status, and this is the mechanism which will allow people to remain. It is up to individuals to put in their application for settled status, but employers such as charities and social enterprises can help to make this process as smooth as possible, which will be both to the benefit of your organisations and the individuals who work for you. So it certainly would be helpful for you to take time to firstly understand how many EU nationals are working for you, to pass on information so that they understand the steps they need to take in order to ensure they have settled status, and then follow up with them to check whether or not they have taken those steps. And as I say, that should hopefully make the process, if it comes to a no-deal scenario, as simple as possible for your organisation. So briefly, what does the scheme do? It ensures that EU nationals and family members who are resident in the UK before we leave can get the status they need to stay. And settled status will protect in UK law the current rights that EU nationals have under EU law. And government's starting point here is to be doing everything it can to help people to get that status where they're eligible. We're not in the business of trying to find reasons to decline. So who needs to apply? The scheme is for EU citizens, but also citizens from other European Economic Area countries, such as Norway, as well as Swiss citizens. It is also there for any family members of EU nationals who are not from the EU themselves. As I said before, it's for people who are currently resident in the UK and who intend to stay afterwards, after we leave the European Union. Irish citizens do not need to apply, but they are welcome to do so if they wish to. And as I said, the responsibility lies with the individual, not with the employer. So how and when should people be applying? So firstly, to say the scheme is completely free, there should be no charges whatsoever to apply for settled status. It's all available online and should be a very quick and simple process. And to kind of evidence this, for most applications where people have all the information they need ready and available when they start the process, the turnaround time is usually between 1 and 4 days, so it is really quick. The application process follows a 3-step process. Starts off with proof of ID, usually in the form of a passport, proof of residence in the UK, and then finally a criminal record declaration and independent check. So a couple of kind of key timing considerations that you'll need to think about if you're going to support any EU nationals in your workforce to apply. So if we leave with a deal, if we secure that deal the government's working for, then citizens will have until the 30th of June 2021 to apply for settled status. And that's because we move into the transitional period that's previously agreed with the EU. If we leave without a deal, then citizens will only have until the 31st of December 2020 to put in their application. So really important that they and yourself as an employer are mindful of those deadlines. As I said at the outset, it is for individuals to apply and not the responsibility of the employer. However, it can make the process much easier and smoother for both you and your staff if you do take 3 steps, which are, again, make sure you know where you have EU nationals in your staff, make sure they know about the scheme, and check that they have applied for settled status within the deadlines that I mentioned before. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. So appearing on your screen now, you'll see a list of useful links. Government's produced a very comprehensive set of guidance on the rights of everyone in a no-deal scenario, and as Tom said, it's important to engage with those and work out where that affects you. This webinar will be available on our website, on our YouTube after the broadcast, so those links will be available to click on after we've finished today. We're going to move on now to data, and for that I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Johnson and I'm in the Domestic Data Protection team in DCMS. This team is responsible for developing and implementing data protection policy in the UK and looking at the risks and opportunities for data protection. So this part of the webinar is to explain what the UK leaving the EU without a deal means for data flows and data protection, and what you need to think about in terms of your organisation. So first of all, I'm just going to quickly go over what won't change in a no-deal Brexit. And just to clarify what I mean about when I'm talking about data flows, by data flows I just mean the movement of data between organisations. And in this case, the data I'm referring to is personal data. And this is any information that can be used to identify a living individual. So this could be a donor or an individual your charity provides services to. It includes things like their name, their physical address, their IP address, HR data for staff that work in your organisation, such as their working hour and payroll details. So the UK government is aware organisations rely heavily on data flows for their day-to-day activities, and sharing personal data is important for organisations to function. We therefore understand organisations want to see the free flow of data between the EU and the UK maintained after we leave the EU, and this is a priority for the UK government. Currently, rules governing the collection and use of personal data are set at EU level, and this is by the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, as it's also known as. In the UK, the Data Protection Act 2018 and GDPR provide a comprehensive data protection framework. So if the UK leaves the EU without no deal, there'll be no immediate changes to UK's data protection standards. GDPR will be brought into UK law, and our domestic law will be pretty much identical to that of the EU regulations. The Information Commissioner will remain the UK's independent supervisory authority on data protection. It still means that charities, organisations need to make sure that they're GDPR compliant. The UK government is committed to leading global standards on data protection, as shown by the introduction of the Data Protection Act last year, and protecting the privacy of individuals will continue to be a priority if we leave without a deal. So if you want to transfer personal data out of the UK to the EU, the UK government has committed to allow personal data to continue to flow freely between the EU and the UK. This means if your organisation will not have to do anything to send personal data to the EU. But now I'm going to talk about what will change if we have a no-deal Brexit. So as I've said, it's in everyone's interest the exchange of personal data between the EU and the UK continues in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But the key issue is around the transfer of personal data from the EU to the UK. So not from the UK to the EU, it's the other way around, the EU to the UK. So if the UK leaves without a deal, we become a third party under the EU GDPR. This means transferring data from the EU to the UK will become restricted, and to transfer personal data, additional legal safeguards will be needed. And UK and EU organisations will need to ensure that data transfers are lawful through additional steps that will need to be taken, which I'll discuss on the next slide. So the next slide goes on to what you need to do to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. The first thing you really need to do to think about as an organisation is determine if you receive any personal data from other organisations or businesses in the EU. So the key here is if it's from organisation and businesses. It's not if it's directly from individuals, it's just if it's from organisation and businesses. So look at where you get your data from. If you get your data from any organisations or the charities or suppliers or processes in the EU, and think about what data you receive. And I'll go in on the next slide, go into more detail about what kind of data that might be. And if you do work out that your organisation does receive personal data from other organisations or businesses or charities in the EU, then the best thing you can do is to consult the Information Commissioner's Office or the ICO. Look at their website, because they've got a range of guidance on their website about kind of next steps you need to take and what you need to do to put kind of additional legal safeguards in place if you want to transfer, if data needs to be transferred between the EU and the UK. And a key example of a legal safeguard is implementing changes to contracts that you might have using standard contract clauses. As I said, if you look on the ICO website, there's much more details around those on the website. So the next slide kind of just gives some detail on kind of identifying personal data flows for your organisation. Some of these are a bit more business focused, but they could be applicable to your organisation or charity. So it's kind of data around trading goods. This could be things like delivery address details or bank account details. It could also be if you trade or provide services. So there may be the names and addresses of any donors or service users. It could also be personnel files if you outsource any kind of HR activities or any of your accounts or any of your back office functions. And also if you have any other kind of offices or branches in the EU, it could be the transferring of data between your head office and other offices that you might have, and also the transferring of kind of personal HR data as well. It's also quite important to make sure you think about where your personal data is stored in your organisation, because a lot of organisations now use cloud-based storages like iCloud, Google, and that kind of thing. So if you do use one of those or any kind of external databases, have a kind of look and a check about where that data is actually stored, because it could be in a country in the EU. So on to the next slide. That just gives you kind of some links and some kind of where to go for more information. So you can visit the gov.uk Brexit page for, it's got specific data protection and guide and advice on that page, and also some more general kind of no deal preparation kind of information. And as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, the ICO website is key. There's kind of lots of guidance and step-by-step help on that page to prepare if you need to transfer personal data. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So at that point, we're going to have a pause from all the information and ask you a question. So that poll should appear on your screen now. What we want to know is where you're getting your information and guidance on Brexit. It'll be really helpful for us when we engage with the sector to know what people's most useful source of information is, so we can kind of tailor our efforts in certain directions. So are you speaking to government? Are you reading the government pages that we've seen lots of examples of so far? Are you speaking to sector bodies like NCVO or our sibling councils in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, or perhaps organisations like Bond who deal with international development charities? Are you just kind of using search engines or reading what the media says, or are you looking elsewhere for your information? And if so, again, as with the last poll, it would be good to know if you say elsewhere, where you're getting that information from. So, interestingly enough, we've got sector bodies coming back with 43% as the highest percentage there. Again, you know, NCVO, as one of the sector bodies, tries to put out as much information as we can. We've obviously published this guidance today, which we hope you find useful. We would obviously also encourage organisations to engage with all of the guidance the government has put out. It's very thorough and it's very, very practical. And a lot of what we've done in our own guidance is to signpost you to guidance that government has published and guidance that other organisations have published, both within civil society and in other sectors. So at that stage, we're going to move on to funding. And for funding, I'm going to hand over to Andrew.
Hello everybody, my name is Andrew. I also work in the Office for Civil Society along with Tom, who spoke earlier. I'm going to talk a bit about funding and the government guarantee. The Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, is responsible for 3 particular funds in relation to the government guarantee. Now, the government guarantee is intended to provide continued funding for UK beneficiaries participating in EU programmes. That's in a no deal if funding from the EU ceases to flow to UK beneficiaries. So the 3 programmes that are on your screen now are the ones that DCMS has direct responsibility for delivering the government guarantee for. They are Creative Europe, Europe for Citizens, and Connecting Europe Facility and Telecoms, or CEF. It's worth noting that DCMS has an interest, and you may also have an interest, in other EU programmes that will also be connected to the guarantee, such as Erasmus+, European Solidarity Corps, and the European Social Fund. Other departments are also putting in place similar arrangements as I'm talking about for these 3 programmes, for the likes of the European Social Fund Horizon 2020. So what does the government guarantee cover? So this is just if there's no Brexit deal. The government has guaranteed to cover the payment of awards where UK organisations have successfully bid directly to the European Commission before exit day, and that covers the lifetime of the project. The second bullet here, the guarantee also covers the payment of awards that were successful as a third party or a third country after exit until the end of 2020 for the lifetime of the project. It's worth noting that that's kind of the approach for the government guarantee as a whole. For the 3 funds discussed here, the EU regulations for those funds don't facilitate third country participation. So successful bids are those that have been approved directly by the European Commission or the relevant EU agency acting on its behalf. So the continued participation of UK organisations in the 3 funds, in Creative Europe, Europe for Citizens, and Connecting Europe Facility and Telecoms. If there is no deal, then any continued participation of UK organisations is likely to require the EU's agreement. A point that's really important for you to be aware of is that the UK government's guarantee only covers funding committed to UK organisations, so it does not cover funding committed to partners and participants in other member states or other participating countries. This includes projects where a UK organisation is the lead member of a consortium, so the guarantee does not cover funding that would be distributed on to non-UK beneficiaries. I think if anyone has any particular questions about that, we would welcome them after the webinar. So what do organisations need to do? So if you are currently receiving funding from the EU for one of the 3 programmes, then you will need to register each project with us as soon as possible in order to be registered for the guarantee. On your screen should be an email address, so you should send a copy of the original application made to the EU and the grant agreement to the email address on your screen, euguarantee@culture.gov.uk. And then also submit project information on the DCMS online registration form. There's also a link there on the slides. The email address and the form will remain open after the UK leaves the EU, so UK applicants can still continue to register their projects with DCMS. We do encourage people to register sooner though, if possible. There is further guidance on the delivery of the guarantee for Creative Europe, Europe for Citizens and Connecting Europe Facility and Telecoms on gov.uk, which is also linked on this slide. So how will the government guarantee be administered? DCMS have procured services of a third-party grant administrator who will deliver and manage the grants under the guarantee. And they'll manage all of the grants and be the main point of contact for all beneficiaries. If you are an organisation based in Scotland, the guarantee in relation to Creative Europe and Europe for Citizens will actually be delivered by the Scottish Government and not by the grant administrator. However, still go through the same process described, and DCMS will pass information to the Scottish Government for them to contact you separately. I mentioned earlier links to other funds. You may have interest in other funds. Particular ones that I want to just raise here are Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps. The Department for Education maintains responsibility for delivering the guarantee for Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps, which will be delivered through another delivery partner. Again, there's guidance on how to register for the guarantee and how the guarantee works for Erasmus Plus and ESC available on gov.uk, which is also linked. The same principles apply in that the guarantee does not cover funding committed to non-UK partners or participants. Yeah, and that's all from me. Welcome any questions afterwards.
Thanks very much. This one I'm just going to hand over to Tom very briefly, who's going to just expound on that a little bit in relation to other areas of funding that DCMS aren't always necessarily responsible for directly.
Thank you. As Andrew said, the guarantee applies to a range of different funds, including the European Social Fund. The Department for Work and Pensions is responsible for the European Social Fund, and we know that they are taking active steps to ensure that similar guarantee arrangements are in place. And we know that for many of you who receive funding through that fund may benefit from the Building Better Opportunities programme, which is delivered by the National Lottery Community Fund, and DWP and TNLCF are working actively together to put in place plans to administer the guarantee if it is required. So there will be support there as well. I also wanted to say a little bit about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. There's a lot of funds we're mentioning this afternoon, this isn't in relation to no deal specifically, but we know it's something that's of particular interest to many in the sector. So we wanted to give a very brief update on where that is. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be the domestic replacement for the European Structural and Investment Funds. Those funds include the European Social Fund. The UK SPF, as it's known, was announced in the government's manifesto before the 2017 general election, and the Communities and Local Growth Unit, which is a joint unit between the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, has been working to develop the UK SPF. They've been working across government to make that possible and engaging with a range of different stakeholders. The Office for Civil Society has been feeding in, and we've been particularly feeding in on our interests around the inclusion of kind of further work around to support social inclusion that the European Social Fund does now, and trying to represent the interests of civil society organisations in any future fund design. And we're by no means the lone voice in the room in discussing how those aspects need to be reflected in UK SPF. There's a wide awareness of the importance of those aspects across government. The Communities and Local Growth Unit has been talking for some time about a potential consultation, but there have been various delays for a variety of reasons. And obviously with the new government coming in recent weeks under the new Prime Minister, they're taking stock with the new Secretary of States across government about next steps on UK SPF. We are being told that a consultation is planned and will be happening soon, and OCS is very keen to work with our partners, including NCVO and others across the sector, to make sure that your voice is heard fully and loudly in that consultation process. So it's a bit of a kind of watch this space at the moment, but we will be coming out with more information through our partner organisations as soon as we know more.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'm actually going to hand back to Tom again to talk about one last issue, and then we will cover a few final points and close with some questions and answers. So back to Tom for state aid.
State aid, yes. So for those of you out there who don't know much about state aid, please don't worry about it. This is primarily an issue which affects government and how we interact with civil society organisations, particularly how we fund you. However, we do know that many in the sector, particularly representative bodies and others, are interested in whether there are going to be any changes to state aid rules. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that. So for those who don't know, state aid are the European regulations that that tell governments how they can and can't invest in particular organisations and sectors, because they're trying to avoid any impact on competition and open competition across the European Union, and trying to make sure that that competition is fair. Government has to give careful consideration to who they're funding, why they're funding them, and how much they're funding. And there was some potential expectation that with the UK leaving the European Union, particularly with a no deal, that excuse me, that state aid rules could be relaxed. However, at the moment there are no plans to relax state aid rules. The regulation comes direct from the European Union. It doesn't currently sit within UK legislation. However, in the event of a no deal, UK legislation will be brought forward to cover state aid rules, and the UK will confirm a UK-based organisation which will oversee state aid rules from UK-based public sector bodies. So this is just to confirm that at the moment, regardless of the outcome, state aid rules will not be changing.
Thanks, Tom. The last issue we're going to touch on today is volunteering. Obviously, there are a fair few volunteering programmes like Erasmus and the Solidarity Corps that run by the EU voluntary service, and this will be of interest, of course, to lots of people throughout the sector as to what happens next. There's two elements to this as it applies to volunteers from the EU who are currently volunteering in the UK, and UK volunteers who are currently volunteering in the EU. With regards to the volunteers based in the UK, unless we see a change to the current visa regime, non-EEA citizens the system used for those people will apply to EEA citizens, so EU citizens looking to volunteer in the UK after a no-deal scenario, if that's what happens. That involves registering for a Tier 5 visa. Again, there's a great deal of information in our guide that goes into what a Tier 5 visa is and what it looks like and how one applies for it. But it means that applicants have to register with a registered volunteering provider, and that there are certain restrictions on the hours they can volunteer. We don't yet have any guidance from government on what happens to volunteers who are not in paid work, who are volunteering in the UK, and whether or not they will qualify for the settlement scheme. So there is some uncertainty around that, and of course NCVO is continuing to work with government to get some assurances for those people. As it applies to UK citizens volunteering in the EU, much of that depends on the decisions made by individual governments of individual member states. Several member states have already stated that there won't be any change to the rights of UK citizens living there or volunteering there or working there. And of course, that's very, very positive. And we know that Erasmus Plus will remain as a standalone programme until the end of 2020. So people participating in that already will be able to continue their participation until the end of their programme. After that, we don't yet know what will happen to those people. So as I say, it will depend on the edicts given by individual governments. So before we wrap up today, we're going to finish with one last poll. Again, these are very, very useful for us to gauge where we can provide the most support throughout the sector. So we want to know where your biggest area of focus or concern is when you're having trustee meetings, or within the organisation, which areas you think you need to take the most steps in to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. We've got all the ones we've covered today, funding, data and workforce being the big ones. As with the other polls, I've put other in. If there is an other, please do let us know what the other is. It's very useful for us. So the results are coming in now, a bit closer than the others, but 32% of you have said funding. Of course, that comes as no surprise. I'm going to touch very quickly in the next slide on some funding things that Tom has just mentioned to do with the Shared Prosperity Fund and the guarantee. And again, I'll come back to those in a second. But before I do, I'm just going to mention very briefly the political fallout of the last few days. Obviously, none of you will have missed the tumultuous events that have been going on in Westminster. And the most important thing to take from all this is that, as we've already heard today, no deal hasn't been ruled out. The bill that was introduced by Hilary Benn and has received assent on Monday this week does attempt to enforce a delay to Brexit to avoid a no-deal scenario, but it is unable to take a no-deal scenario off the table. And the reason we are mentioning this is, of course, it's incredibly important that charities are aware of that and that charities are preparing for any exit, including a no-deal exit, which remains very much a possibility. What it does do is mandate the Prime Minister to seek an extension from Brussels if he has been unable to secure a deal by the 19th of October. Of course, if he does secure a deal and it passes Parliament, then we leave the EU as planned on the 31st of October. But it will make it difficult for him to leave with no deal on the 31st. Instead, it will ask him to delay that date to the 31st of January. Of course, that itself is contingent on the EU member states agreeing to that. But the big takeaway is that with Parliament suspended, with, for now at least, no general election planned, no deal Brexit remains on the table, whether it's the 31st of October or the 31st of January or some other date. It's very important to note that, and to note that 31st of January is only 12 weeks away, so it's very important to be acting now on the issues we've raised today. And again, please do look through our guidance for a kind of fuller explanation of some of the issues that we've touched on. The only other thing I wanted to mention was general economic considerations. Now, I'm not going to make any predictions about anything to do with no deal today, but there are, of course, some areas that the government has acknowledged in its technical notifications and in its output on Brexit, which are important for charities to note, mainly as they apply to things like supply chains and goods. Again, we've made reference to these in our guidance, and it's important that you're looking at those specifically, which may not seem like immediate concerns, but sort of secondary concerns. But for instance, say you work in health and social care in a hospice, for instance, thinking about something like food supplies is important, and it's important to be looking at what the government is saying about what a no-deal Brexit might mean for those and how you can prepare for that. So please do have a look through everything we've said today. This, as I say, this webinar will remain available. Have a look through what NCVO's published today, and engage with the huge amount of resources the government has put out. The Office of Society has also produced a 5 steps for Brexit thing, which is available on their website and is again full of practical information about things that civil society organisations can do in the very short term to put in place decent preparation plans. So we will wrap up there and open the floor to questions. We've already got quite a few that have been sent in. So if we don't manage to get to your question, I do apologise. After this, if your question hasn't been resolved, please don't hesitate to get in touch with NCVO through our website, and we will be able to, or on social media, or whichever way is easiest for you, and we will attempt to address whatever you raise as best as possible. So I'm going to start with a question from Simon. I'll direct this one to Tom, if I may. Simon asks, what are the implications of applying for settled status if you hold a criminal record?
So the guidance at the moment says that if you have a minor criminal record or criminal incident, like speeding tickets and things like that, that shouldn't be an issue for obtaining settled status. The guidance says on any more serious convictions that they will be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks very much. Hopefully that addresses that one, Simon. A question from Sarah, for Sarah, even from Chloe. I think you addressed this, but it's worth just reiterating the point because it's quite an important one. So she's asked about data and servers. So does the data you're talking about include data stored on our own servers that's hosted in EU countries?
Yes, it would. So if you've got any data based on servers in EU countries, then yes, you'd need to look at putting additional legal safeguards in place. And I would direct you to the ICO website to look at what you need to do.
Thanks very much. We've got a question, just a statement, which is actually quite useful from someone called Keelan. When we asked about one of the other selections, one of the polls, this one relating to information, Keelan has said that they speak to their local Chamber of Commerce, which has a dedicated Brexit hub. I think that's actually a very good suggestion, and I certainly would recommend. We've done some signposting to this ourselves. Local organisations and chambers of commerce and local government who have their own Brexit pages on their websites, which are available and are often very good at kind of tailoring information to local issues. So please do look at those. So I've got a question from Simon, and I'll take this one. It's about volunteering. So Simon has asked, would volunteers at an organisation need to apply for settled status in the same way as an employee? Now, this is a slightly difficult question. It depends on what that volunteer is in the country for, i.e. are they just in the country to volunteer, or are they in paid work and they also volunteer at an organisation? If they, essentially the answer is yes. If they are in the country and are working in the country, then they will need to apply for settled status. What Tom said earlier about employers is important. Whilst it's incumbent on the individual, the reason we've highlighted these issues is that employers are able to talk to their employees about what they can do, what their rights are, and what they need to do in order to gain settled status. Again, I think I made mention of this earlier. We are still requesting information from government on what happens to EU nationals who are volunteering in the UK who are not in paid work and whether or not they will be eligible for settled status. We don't know the answer to that yet, and hopefully we'll get some clarity from the Home Office soon. Fiona has asked, does the HMG guarantee cover funding committed from DFIF? I'm not entirely sure what DFIF is.
I'm not sure. I wonder if it's Department for International Development, and there may be a typo in there. But if it is Department for International Development, then yes, the guarantee also applies to funding from that. I've just done a quick Google for DFIF. I couldn't immediately find anything, but if you do come back with more information afterwards, we'll try and answer that question.
Thanks very much. Another volunteering one from Eva. Eva's asked, are Tier 5 visas also necessary with casual volunteering if the person is in full-time work? No, if the person is in full-time work and now are an EU national, they will need to apply for settled status, which will, if they're successful in that application, and as Tom said earlier, the government is looking to grant those applications. They're not looking to reject them at all. If they are successful in attaining settled status, they won't also need a visa, because that will grant them exactly the same rights as EU nationals enjoy in the UK already. I'm going to address another non-question, but a point raised by someone called Manish on one of our polls. It was a question about the areas of concern or focus. So Manish has raised the cost of medicines as an area of concern. I obviously touched on this when I was talking about health and social care. Again, the government has put out a series of technical notices on what happens in a no-deal Brexit, and they're undertaking a very big operation at the moment to ensure that there is as little supply chain disruption as possible, though they are predicting some if we get a no-deal scenario. I would encourage you to look at both what the government is saying about what happens to both the supply and cost of medicines in a no-deal scenario, but also what the NHS and the NHS Federation are saying about this. They've done a lot of work on supplies of medicines and things like that in a no-deal Brexit. If that's difficult to come by, please do get in touch with NCVO, and we can point you in the right direction, or point you to a specialist on things like costs of medicines. I've got a question from Pasha. We have 150 volunteers who volunteer 1 hour a week each. Do we need to order the immigration status of all those volunteers? I think that's one for me as well. I'll try to not do all the questions. So one of the things we've suggested in our guidance is to undertake an audit of staff to identify who might need to apply for settled status and who might need to work out and speak to government about what their rights are. So yes, I certainly would encourage working out which staff might need support and which staff or volunteers indeed might need to be made aware of their rights. And I think that's quite an important step that employers can take to kind of support them through the process. And obviously, one of the things that Tom said is that if we get a no-deal scenario, the application will be due by the end of December 2020.
That's correct.
Which feels like it could be a long way away, but actually is not really much time. So whilst the application is a quick process, 1 to 4 days, I think Tom said, it's important to be thinking about those things now and kind of acting quickly so that it's out the way and done.
And I should say it's 1 to 4 days where all of the necessary information is easily available. So for people who have less sort of standard 9 to 5 jobs, may find it hard to pull the relevant information together, so that can delay that process. So important to make sure that you're doing it sooner. And also, just back to that question, there is no requirement to audit the immigration status of either volunteers or staff. It's making an assessment for your organisation as to what would be most helpful with the transition. So if you know that many of your volunteers are EU nationals, then it could make it easier for you in transitioning in a no deal or a deal scenario to understand that they are taking up the settled status offer.
Thanks very much. We've got a question on funding from Damien. Damien's asked if a Creative Europe Network's funding goes directly to another member state, in a no-deal scenario, UK organisations are no longer able to participate in that project. Would the government guarantee the lost income?
So the government guarantee does apply for collaborative projects where the UK organisation is involved, but just for the UK government's part in that project. That still applies where the lead is not a UK organisation for ESC and Erasmus+. I'm not so close to the detail on that particular fund, and I would recommend just getting in touch directly, I think with the email address that's on the slides, and we can direct that to the policy team in particular on that.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Just one last point's been raised about immigration, and someone's asked when we know what the new immigration proposals are. Now, obviously, immigration is something that is related to Brexit politically, of course, but is not part of the no-deal scenario beyond the EU settlement scheme, which we've talked about fairly extensively. It is important to be looking and keeping an eye on what immigration proposals are put forward by the government, because it may impact your organisation. For instance, if you work in a medical research charity, you need to keep an eye on what's being said by the government about the rights of people to come and work here, whether or not the medical researchers qualify as high skilled or low skilled. And I would point you to the government's MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee, who have today published a call for evidence on salary thresholds, which is a big part of whether or not people qualify as high skilled or low skilled. So it's important to be looking at that.
And just to add to that, from the Office for Civil Society's perspective, so this is one of our areas, our priority areas within our EU exit team. I believe the work that the MAC have been doing, the Migration Advisory Committee have been doing, they're just taking stock of our new Prime Minister's kind of perspectives on future immigration arrangements. They had launched a year-long kind of consultation process on an initial paper that was put out. So I think they're taking stock of that. But whatever happens, OCS will be having some dedicated conversations with partners across the sector about the implications of new future immigration arrangements for the sector.
Thanks, Tom. I think that's all we've got time for today. So just to say thank you very much to Andrew, Sarah, and Tom from DCMS who've come over to assist in this webinar today. We hope you found it very useful. As I've said throughout, if you have any further questions or issues you'd like to raise with us, please don't hesitate to get in touch with NCVO, and we will get back to you as soon as we can with hopefully some productive information. And just one last time to remind you that we have published our guidance today, and it should be available on our website now. So please do have a look, and if there are any further issues, get in touch. Thank you very much.